This episode is a Trackpads.com production. Welcome to Headline Wednesday from Dispatch U.S. Military History Magazine, developed by Trackpads.com. Each week, we take one pivotal moment from United States military history and follow it from the first warning signs to the final outcome. Today, we go to Guadalcanal in the Second World War for the story of Henderson Field.
The airstrip at the center of this story did not look like the heart of a campaign. Henderson Field was a rough scar hacked out of red clay and jungle, with pierced steel planking laid over the dirt and wrecked aircraft sitting along its edges. On many nights in late 1942, Marines and soldiers lay in foxholes around the field, listening as the distant rumble of engines offshore grew heavier. Then Japanese naval guns opened fire, walking shells up and down the runway until dirt, metal, and palm fronds lifted into the air. Every concussion threatened the strip that daylight flying depended on. The men knew the airfield was small, but it was everything. Cactus Air Force pilots and ground crews flattened themselves in slit trenches while shells struck near parked fighters, dive bombers, fuel dumps, and repair areas. Out over Ironbottom Sound, Japanese cruisers and destroyers tried to erase the field in the dark. In the pauses between salvos, defenders checked weapons by touch and waited for the ground attacks that often followed bombardment. Henderson Field was only a rough clearing in the jungle, but to the men guarding it, it felt like the center of the island.
Henderson Field mattered because Guadalcanal was never just about one island. The strip gave the United States a land-based airfield along the long supply line running from the American West Coast toward Australia. From Henderson, fighters and bombers could strike Japanese ships moving through the Solomon Islands, harass troop transports, and cover Allied convoys bringing in men, ammunition, food, fuel, and spare parts. If Japan knocked the field out or overran it, the seaway toward Australia could reopen to Japanese pressure. The airfield was a hinge.
For Japanese planners, retaking Henderson Field meant tightening their defensive perimeter and pushing Allied power away from the South Pacific. That is why they fed infantry, artillery, and shipping into one attempt after another to crush the garrison. Destroyers and cruisers of the so-called Tokyo Express risked submarines and air attack to bring troops and supplies down the island chain at night. They were willing to bleed for this strip because it threatened everything they were trying to hold.
For the Americans, Guadalcanal was a thin and dangerous gamble. The Marines who first seized the unfinished airstrip and the Army units that later joined them operated at the far end of a narrow logistical rope. Supplies arrived unevenly and were never enough to make anyone feel secure. Ships unloading by day risked Japanese air attack, while ships working by night risked Japanese surface forces. Yet every day Henderson Field remained open, the Cactus aircraft made Japanese movement in daylight more costly and uncertain. The airfield became both shield and sword.
The field had not begun as an American project. In August 1942, United States Marines landed on Guadalcanal to seize the half-built Japanese airstrip near the island's north coast. The landing was rough but successful, and resistance at the airfield itself was light. Within days, Marines formed a loose defensive ring around the runway, while engineers and aviation ground crews improved the surface, cut revetments into the trees, and prepared the strip for combat aircraft.
The name Henderson Field honored a Marine aviator killed earlier in the Battle of Midway. The aircraft that gathered there became known as the Cactus Air Force, after the code word for Guadalcanal. Marine, Navy, and Army pilots flew from the rough runway to challenge Japanese control of daylight in the Central Solomons. They attacked troop convoys, bombed nearby positions, and protected cargo ships trying to sustain the garrison. Every sortie made the unfinished airstrip more valuable and more dangerous.
The position was brittle from the beginning. The naval defeat off Savo Island left the Marines ashore with fewer friendly ships nearby than planners had hoped. Japanese commanders quickly recognized the field as a threat that had to be erased. Colonel Ichiki's detachment marched inland expecting to brush the Americans aside, but it was destroyed near the Ilu River in a sharp fight that shocked both sides. Other Japanese units probed the jungle approaches, testing the perimeter and searching for gaps. As the campaign settled in, the rhythm became harsh and predictable. By day, Cactus fighters rose from the runway to intercept Japanese bombers coming down the channel known as the Slot. Dive bombers and attack aircraft hunted transports, destroyers, and barges trying to bring men and supplies to Guadalcanal. Ground crews worked in heat, dust, and danger to refuel, rearm, and repair battered aircraft with limited resources. Each sortie helped keep pressure on the Japanese, but each one also consumed supplies the defenders could barely replace. By night, the pattern reversed. Japanese warships raced down the Slot to shell Henderson Field and the defensive ring around it. Heavy shells tore up the runway, shredded parked aircraft, broke telephone lines, and shook dugouts and command posts. In the shattered quiet after those barrages, Japanese infantry often moved forward through the jungle, trying to break the thin Marine and Army positions before daylight returned. The defenders knew that if a gap opened along the perimeter, the enemy could reach the airfield. Some of the most important fighting took place along the ridges south of Henderson Field. There, steep ground and narrow spines of high terrain forced attackers into channels. Marines under leaders such as Merritt Edson and under Division Commander Alexander Vandegrift held thin lines against determined night assaults. Men fired by muzzle flash, guided by shouted orders, flares, and the sound of movement in the dark. Artillery observers called fire on Japanese columns they could rarely see clearly. The ridges became the shield of the airfield. Japanese commanders also tried to pressure the entire island. They pushed fresh units forward by destroyer and barge, often landing men already exhausted, hungry, seasick, and short of supplies. They attacked near the Matanikau River, probed eastern sectors, and launched larger assaults aimed at the heart of the Henderson perimeter. The sequence became grimly familiar: naval bombardment, ground attack, close-range night fighting, and then morning light revealing shattered positions and fallen men across the jungle. As long as Henderson remained in American hands, morning also brought the sound of aircraft engines. The Cactus Air Force resumed operations, striking Japanese troop movements, supply points, beachheads, and ships. The campaign became a chain of crises. Could the defenders repair the field fast enough? Could they shift reserves to the right part of the line? Could they keep aircraft flying for one more day? Over time, those single days added up. By late October, Japanese commanders prepared a concentrated offensive against the southern and western approaches to Henderson Field. They hoped to use jungle corridors and ridgelines to slip close, form up unseen, and crack the perimeter in one violent blow. But the defenders had learned the ground through weeks of patrols and earlier attacks. They had registered artillery, placed machine guns, built hasty obstacles, and dug positions along the key ridges. What looked like a useful approach on a map became a funnel under fire. On the crucial nights, American firepower and communication held at points where the line could have broken. Forward observers whispered corrections over field telephones and radios. Riflemen shifted to plug gaps. Runners carried orders through darkness and smoke.
At critical moments, 37mm guns firing canister at close range smashed assaults that had already reached the wire and foxholes. Fresh Army infantry, including the 164th Infantry Regiment, gave the perimeter more depth and automatic weapons just when the Marines needed them most.
The momentum quietly shifted. Earlier Japanese attacks had come dangerously close to the field, but later efforts stalled sooner as hunger, disease, exhaustion, artillery, and air attacks weakened the attackers. The turning of the fight for Henderson Field did not come from one dramatic charge or sweeping counterattack. It came from accumulated advantages in terrain, timing, fire support, endurance, and the ability to keep the airstrip alive day after day.
By the end of 1942, the cost of failed assaults was written across Guadalcanal's jungle trails and ridgelines. Japanese regiments had been shattered, leaders killed or wounded, and supply efforts repeatedly disrupted. In early 1943, Japanese planners began withdrawing surviving units from Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. For the Americans guarding Henderson Field, the first signs were quieter nights, fewer probes, and abandoned positions discovered by patrols. The enemy was leaving, and Henderson had become a springboard.
Holding the airfield allowed Allied commanders to turn Guadalcanal from a vulnerable foothold into a forward base. From Henderson and nearby anchorages, Allied air and naval forces could push farther up the Solomon Islands toward New Georgia, Bougainville, and beyond. The campaign also proved that the United States could sustain a long contested operation far from its main industrial centers. Logistics officers learned how to move fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts through a dangerous sea lane. Commanders refined the coordination of ships, aircraft, artillery, infantry, and reinforcements in a single grinding fight.
The story of Henderson Field still matters because it links small unit endurance to grand strategy. The men in foxholes did not think in terms of sea lanes and future campaigns while shells fell around them. They thought about keeping the runway open for one more dawn, holding one more ridge, saving one more aircraft, and stopping one more night assault. But their success gave higher commanders options that would not have existed if the field had fallen. For students of military history, Henderson Field is a reminder that air, land, and sea power often meet at fragile points on the map. A rough jungle runway became an anchor for later advances and a symbol of determined defense under constant pressure. When we talk about turning points in the Pacific War, Henderson Field belongs in the conversation. The ground the defenders refused to give up helped change the course of an entire theater. You can hear more narrated Headline Wednesday stories through the Dispatch audio editions, and connect with the United States Military History Group on LinkedIn for daily conversation and shared research. Thank you for spending this time with their story and with the study of how one airfield shaped a wider war. Headline Wednesday is developed by Trackpads.com as part of Dispatch, U.S. Military History Magazine.